Hello and welcome everyone here to Spirit of Truth Church for this talk on the socioeconomic background of the intertestamental period. So this is an interesting topic. We've covered the religious background, we've covered the political background, and today we're going to be taking a look at what life was like back then for people in Israel, in the nation of Israel, in Samaria, in Judah, during the time of the intertestamental period and leading into and including the early church age. And so this is going to feel a little bit more like a geography, social studies kind of lesson. That's just the nature of the content. So do bear with me as we kind of walk through this together, but I'll be trying to point out some interesting aspects about these things. My hope is that this is going to help you understand why the stories that Jesus talks about and uses actually are very, very much of that time. That these were stories and parables and things that people would have known a lot about and that were very and readily accessible to people in that era. So let's go ahead and talk about the geography of the Middle Eastern land. So you have the fertile coastal plain. So this is the area running right up against the Mediterranean Sea. And you have a lot of port cities here. There's a lot of seafaring, there's a lot of trade. It's a good place to grow fruits and vegetables. It's, again, very fertile land. It's very green as well. You then have the central hill country. And the central hill country is farmable, and it's the foothills. So again, in North Carolina, for example, we have the coast, the Piedmont, and the mountains. They kind of have the foothills. So it's a little bit more rugged than the Piedmont is. But it's rugged, it's rocky terrain. There's a lot of trees that grow here, so it's a good production of timber. And then you have the less rugged parts that were where shepherds would have their flocks in the vineyards. You'd have olives and grapes being grown there. So again, the wine and the olive oil, common products. You have orchards of fig trees. You'd have crops and a lot of small villages you'd find in the central hill country. And this really divided Israel into the north and the south, the central hill country. You also have the valley of Jezreel in southern Galilee. And this is also the entire Jordan River Valley. And that's sort of the country's breadbasket. This would be like the Midwest here in America, where you'd have grains and wheat, and you'd produce a lot of those types of things. And then you have southern Judea and Idumea, which contains the Great Desert, or the wilderness area. You'd have a lot of nomads and herds, sheep, goats, and camels, and things like that. So again, you've got everything from bustling kind of little towns and cities. You have Jerusalem, obviously, being the big one, one of the big ones. And you also have little towns and villages. It's a very agrarian society in many ways. People are basically growing things from the land or tending flocks. That's a very common job at that point. You also have the Central Ridge Mountains. Now, these go from about 1,500 to 3,500 feet above sea level on average. Mount Hermon, though, crests over 9,200 feet. And interestingly enough, 100 miles away from there, you have the Dead Sea, which is 1,296 feet below sea level. So you've got a literal 10,000 foot change in elevation over just a 100-mile period. And it's funny because it's below freezing with snow at the top of Mount Hermon, and then it's a hot, dry desert down by the Dead Sea in just the same season. Winter, by the way, is a rainy season, and summer is a dry season. So they operate much more with the equatorial understanding of seasons, where you have it's going to rain every day versus it's bone dry. And the crops are rotated through 2 harvests per year. Now, in New Testament times, Jerusalem was the largest city in Israel, and it was dominated by the temple and the various precincts. And 1/4 of the city is the walled-in portion of the city, and this is about 1/2 mile long on each side, so it's very big. You also have Herod's Antonia Fortress here, the amphitheater, and a horse riding stadium for the Hellenistic entertainment. The next most important city is Caesarea Maritimius, and this is shipping and trade. It's the Roman prefect's headquarters was found there. Sebast is the center of the city, the center of the population administration in the province of Samaria. Shechem being the next most important city. You also have Sepphoris and Tiberias, the past and present capitals of Galilee, and these were the 2 largest cities in Galilee. So those are just some of the main cities in the area. Now, in terms of population size, cities were very crowded. They were very, very crowded. And people lived in small homes, kind of one on top of another, whereas the countryside was filled with many people working small plots of land. Now, the entire Roman Empire had about 50 million inhabitants, which is kind of amazing back then to think that there was such a large portion. And about 4 million of these were Jewish people. 700,000 of the Jews lived in Israel, and 3 million were scattered throughout the diaspora. So even though they had the temple back, and even though they had kind of Judah and Samaria, things like that, reinstated as sort of provinces, the Israelites, the Jewish people, were never returned. Since the original dispersion, since the original exile, the fullness of the Jewish people have never been back in Israel. Even at this time, 3 million were scattered throughout the diaspora, and only 700,000 were actually present in Israel. Now, Alexandria and Antioch were Gentile cities with large Jewish populations, which is why you have churches associated with them very early on, and also why you have essentially large Jewish thought centers associated with those two cities as well. Rome had about 1 million people, just for comparison, and many people were moving to the cities in the hope of a better life. Interestingly enough, about a third of the population in Rome was slaves. Now, slaves had a wide gamut in terms of what a slave actually was. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later, the New Testament times slavery and how to understand that. Alexandria had about 750,000 people, so it was roughly the size of Jerusalem, which, pretty big. Antioch had about 500,000. Athens, Tarsus, Ephesus, Philippi, Thessalonica, and Corinth were sitting at about 100,000 people. Jerusalem had 25,000 people in the walled-in portion, and no more than 100,000 people in the metropolitan area. So Jerusalem, again, by comparison, much smaller than Alexandria, certainly much smaller than Rome. Again, no more than 100,000 in the metropolitan area. The majority of Galilee was made up of as many as 200 small villages, and few were as large as Capernaum, which was about 100,000 people. So when Jesus goes to Capernaum, you can kind of get a feel for how big that is. Additionally, there was a lot of Jew-Gentile tension. There's a lot of Gentiles mixing in with the Jewish people all throughout the region. There was a pro-Herodian bureaucracy that was very much in state at this point, and there were strong rural-urban animosities. So the people in the cities didn't think too highly of the people in the rural areas, and the people in the rural areas thought the people in the cities were kind of stuck on themselves. Again, the people in the cities don't survive without the agriculture, and so it's a rough situation. There's a lot of tensions going on here. In terms of transportation and communication, they had the best system of travel and communication in the ancient world. This was not replicated until the 17th century, and this was in large part due to the Roman road idea. The major roads linked all major towns. Highways were paved. Smaller roads were dirt. And you could travel basically 25 to 50 miles a day by horse, which is unheard of prior to this. The wagon could get about 7 to 8 miles, and on foot you could get maybe about 20. From Nazareth to Jerusalem was about 3 days. Now, just so you kind of understand this, try walking on a road the next time you're outside. Try walking on a paved road. Then try walking on grass. And then try walking on like nice grass, and then try walking through a forest or just in a field, and you will get the feeling of, oh my goodness, these are 3 very different things. The road is quick, then you get into the grass and things slow down because you're having to move through grass. Then you get to a field and it's very bumpy, you're having to keep your balance more, it's more exhausting, it's much harder to get through. And then a forest, forget it, that slows it down a lot. So having roads is a big deal. Now, the main roads were generally safe, but the roads that were less traveled were often hideouts for thieves and bandits, and this was an issue back then. Inns provided lodging for travelers, but were often hangouts for pirates and prostitutes, so, inns were not necessarily the most reputable places. Again, Jesus wasn't put in an inn, he was probably in a family home as well during the birth. Reputable people essentially stayed in private homes, and hospitality was highly prized. This is a Middle Eastern culture. Hospitality is everything. If you have visiting family, you were going to house them unless you absolutely couldn't. Now, sea travel was popular for trade, but it was dangerous. Especially during wintertime, the seas were virtually untravelable. The high seas were impassable at that point. Cargo boats, in terms of how big they were, could be up to 180 feet in length. They would carry up to 1,200 tons of goods or 600 passengers, so pretty big ships and provisions. And Paul's prison boat, for example, was 276 people, and that's the one mentioned in Acts 27:37. To get to Alexandria, or from Alexandria to Rome, took 10 days going east, or get this, 3 months going west. So again, depending on the direction and season, could vastly change your travel time. Now, going forward and backward in a plane, maybe hour and a half difference. But going by boat, no, that's substantial. That could be the difference between 2 weeks and 3 months. Public news will be posted on notice boards in town squares or announced by heralds at the marketplace. So you'd have literal heralds or clerics announcing things at the public center of activity. And this actually is linked to the early Christian word for proclamation or kerygma, is by the clerics, the herald. Now, why is this important? Because how the gospel is going to get spread in the ancient days is very different than how we tend to think about preaching the gospel now. In the ancient days, you would go to the public market. You would go to the public center, generally to a very large place, and you would preach there. You would share the good news. You would announce these things. And that was accepted. There'd be people of all persuasions doing this. There'd be philosophers doing this and things. So it was a place where news was shared. It was a place where messages were spoken. And the funny thing about that is now we have things like that, interestingly enough, on the internet, but it's a much more restricted and controlled thing. It's very hard to simply share messages with a great group of people. Back then, yeah, you could get knocked out or banned from those places, but it typically wouldn't happen. You hear about people preaching there for a long time, and if people just don't listen, which was the common way of dealing with it, then you left. So that's how it was happened in the early days. You would also have conversations in private with families and things too, absolutely. But when you were doing evangelism for the first time, you would go to the public center or town square. Now, in terms of municipal facilities, privacy didn't really exist back then. Everywhere is very crowded, especially in the cities. And so people spent most of their waking hours outside or away from their homes. You have the Roman baths, which are like hot tubs. They had exercise areas, libraries, and chapels. You had the gymnasia, where you had physical exercise and schooling. You had the town marketplace. You had the stoa, stoicism, the porch, stoa. It's like a modern-day strip mall. And that was laid out in a square with pillars supporting roofs over stores. Very similar, oddly enough, to when you go to Europe and you find a town square. It's a very similar kind of thing. And especially if you ever get to go to Constantinople and you see the big markets, the downtown markets, very similar. Night lighting, interestingly enough, in Antioch, they had over 2.5 miles of oil-lit lamp poles. So they actually had a nightlife at that point, which is kind of cool. And the Alexandrian Library was thought to have housed over 500,000 books, which, again, every time I read about the Alexandrian Library, I just think to myself, oh my goodness, if we could ever recover the things in there, but they were probably destroyed. But man, the wealth about the ancient world, just unparalleled. Now, in terms of homes, wealthy people lived in large multi-story brick villas with inner atria. And interestingly enough, if you ever heard the word atrium, or a place where people would often meet, people had atria in their homes, and these were usually open to the sky. An atrium is usually open to the sky outside, but now modern days they put glass roofs over them and things like that. We had one in our science building in college. And they could fit 50 people easily, so they would host parties and gatherings. And the wealthy people had hot and cold running water, and they had sewage removal as well. It's very modern, actually, in many ways. Israel, however, housed a lot smaller planar adobes and hewn stone structures, so not like the Greeks. One room, the Israelite home was about 1 room to 2-level dwelling, and the living quarters were separated and raised above the animal stalls, so you'd have the animals living in the same home as you. So the homes would smell like animal. I mean, everything would smell like animal. The thing is you kind of get used to it. I mean, if you live with the animals, you just get used to the smell, and that's kind of how it worked. You have plain exteriors for the most part. They formed 3 sides of a rectangle, so you'd actually have like 3 families kind of getting together, 3 homes together, and they formed a rectangle, and you had this kind of shared common area outside, which is kind of neat for socialization. Tenement buildings were like small multi-storied apartment complexes. And one of my favorite things about the ancient world is that the roofs or roofs, however you like to pronounce it, were socializing places. They were flat, and you would often you'd almost count it like a separate room. It was totally open, but people would meet up there. They would socialize up there, and it was beautiful. You could be under the stars at night. I mean, yeah, the roofs were really cool back then, and I kind of miss that. I miss being able to go up and just sit on a roof and have a conversation. We used to do those things back in the day. Again, in college, we had some buildings that were like that. We could sit on a roof, but we don't really have that nowadays in our modern homes. So. Furniture typically was minimal for people. It was very expensive, so furniture was typically for the wealthy. You'd have a fire in the middle of the floor for warmth. Chamber pots were dumped outside in refuse areas that really were very foul and unsanitary. You'd have cisterns and aqueducts that provided a water supply. Again, the Roman aqueduct and the cistern catch the water. In terms of meals and daily schedules, the farmers and craftsmen worked from sun up to sundown. So if there was daylight, you were working, essentially. Well-to merchants worked shorter hours. So if you were a merchant, you had a little bit more leisure time. And they worked typically from early morning to noon, took a siesta, and then worked for a short time after that, and then were done for the day. Wealthier Romans typically ate 4 meals a day. They ate mainly meat and dairy, whereas the Jews typically had 2 meals a day. They ate bread, fruits, nuts, vegetables, and fish. And again, that has a lot to do with the cost of these things. Meat was very much for special occasions. Again, typically Passover and some of these other main religious holidays. The wine was the basic drink of the day. It was healthier than water or milk, which is interesting. But yeah, essentially wine is going to be the thing people drink. But it's 3 times as diluted today. So you're not getting drunk off of wine. It's kind of like a flavored water, but it was definitely healthier in terms of the content of it and things like that. You'd cook with olive oil, and you'd use honey to sweeten things. Salt was essentially how you preserve meat. They didn't have refrigerators back then, so it was salt. And the evening meal ended a day's hard work and was a regular opportunity for intimate socialization. So again, something that we just don't have nowadays, honestly. Over in your home, you would invite your good friends over. You would often go to each other for meals, and you would have up to 2 to 3 hour meals that were extensive conversation. You'd have these discussions all the time. People were always talking. If a formal gathering, you'd recline at the table and one's legs would extend out perpendicular to the table, which is why in Luke 7:38, they had access, the lady who was going to anoint his feet had access to his feet. It was how they would recline and sit. Additionally, you would have your place in this formal occasion according to your status, as in Luke 14:7-11. Now, in terms of clothing and styles, the average Jewish man wore a linen or cotton tunic. In the cooler weather, they might wear a cloak, and that was another, again, thing for safety reasons. So you'd have sandals or shoes, you'd have a head covering, underwear, common things. For prayer, the Jewish men would don distinctive shawls with fringes that were fingered, like a Catholic rosary bead kind of thing, along with phylacteries, which they'd bind around their head or their arms, with scriptures written in them. The Roman man wore a longer toga, and this was actually forbidden to foreigners. You had to be a Roman citizen to wear the toga. And the women wore simpler but colorful robe-like garments. Women would often drape a shawl over their hair. They wore jewelry, perfume, and cosmetics. Jewish men had longer hair than the average Romans, so they had more hair than typical Romans. And the women in both cultures had long hair worn in a bun, especially after getting married, they'd bun their hair. In terms of social classes, you've got the aristocratic empire, which had a largely agrarian society. So you've got a couple of wealthy people and a lot of farmers. And more than half of the total wealth, now think about this in comparison today, more than half total wealth is in the top 1 to 2% of the populace. So that's way more. I mean, we do have our 1%ers, but half the wealth being in 1 to 2%, that we don't have. Other countries do, but not in America. So the emperor, who are these 1 to 2%ers? Emperor himself, the court, the political and military leaders, landed aristocracy, and influential religious leaders. You also had the bureaucracy, which served them, and they were wealthy-ish, and they were about 5 to 7%. You had a small middle class. Again, there's not a lot of middle class positions at that point. Enough to have modest savings, about 15%. This would be priests, Pharisees, fortunate merchants and traders, skilled craftsmen, bankers, and toll collectors. So toll collectors, again, would fit in that middle class. But about 70% of the population, think about that, 70%, were struggling farmers and fishermen or subsistence laborers working for others in fields or factories. So, not factories in the modern day, but factories in terms of making things. And so 70% of your population was poor, or at least, living day to day. And back then, we call a denarius the standard day's wage. This would be enough to buy food for yourself, your family, for the day, with a little left over. Your hired hands were essentially migrant or modern-day migrant workers. They had seasonal employment. And again, 70% of them lived in poverty. 10% or more were outcasts and expendables. They lived well below the subsistence level, and starvation was a real fear. Most of Jesus' disciples came from the poor majority, or the lower end of the middle class. And even poor people, oddly enough, had at least one servant. You can see this in Luke 17:7-10. Zebedee and sons had more than one, Mark 1:20, but they left behind their lifestyle for the itinerant ministry with Christ. Now, slaves is where we get into an interesting comment. So slaves cut across economic distinctions. So I think this would help everyone to understand what biblical times slavery looked like versus modern slavery. Modern slavery was very racial in its nature. and it led to racism. So because again, when you have something like skin color dividing groups of people, racism is something that can happen very quickly. Now, the issue though with slavery in the ancient times in the Middle East and in the Roman Empire is it was not about racism, or it didn't lead to that. Why? It was conquest. If you were a slave, you could typically direct it straight back to being a prisoner of war. Someone in your family was a prisoner of war. Other times, people were just born slaves, again, linked through there, or they sold themselves into slavery to pay their debts. So in other words, things got to a point where you couldn't afford it, and that gets in the tax system. So slaves could own property, they could earn money, they could save enough to buy their own freedom, interestingly enough. Slaves in a wealthy household were sometimes more prestigious than most freedmen and exercised important responsibilities like managing the master's estate and teaching his children. So freedom back then was an interesting thing. No, they couldn't just do whatever they wanted, but they had lives they were happy with. So it's a weird kind of situation for those slaves. However, slaves in the mines had it really rough. They worked in appalling conditions, and that would be more akin to the slavery that we're seeing today in terms of the conditions. Even though, again, it still wasn't race-based, it was conquest-based. So I hope that kind of clears up a little bit about the differences between the difference between slavery back then versus today. And again, why it wasn't necessarily on people's minds to abolish it, per se, back then, is because it was very much part of the socioeconomic system. And there were slaves who had it really rough, but there were also slaves who had it pretty well. And so it wasn't necessarily a system to be overthrown at that time. That wasn't really in the minds of anybody at that point. The comment would be, not, oh, I got to get out of slavery, because often that could be very difficult. Even as a freed person who had no means, that could be very difficult. But for example, for a slave to work his way out of the mines to a better position within the slave system. So again, people had a different view of it back then. Now, what about economic indebtedness? Well, this is a major, major, major issue in the New Testament. It's a major issue in Jesus' time, major issue for the Jews, and one of the reasons why they wanted to overthrow Rome. So taxation, especially by Rome, placed a heavy burden on all of people's earnings. For example, first you have the Jewish triple tithe. 10% is going to the priests and Levites, 10% is going to the temple festivals, and 3.5% is going to the poor. So on top of sales tax and customs and annual tribute paid to the Roman government, which funded their military machine, which also is not happy, they're not happy about, the Roman tax could be anywhere from 3 weeks earnings per year to 30% of all one's income. So you put that with the Jewish triple tithe, 22 and a third percent plus 30%, you're talking about near 50% of one's income just to those things. Then you had the annual temple tax for Jerusalem, which is half shekel or 2 denarii, 2 days' wages. And some Jews paid more than half their wages in tax. And what you have to understand is that you weren't getting when people say, oh, well, you can pay 60% in taxes, and they're thinking, oh, I get free school, and I get free health, and free healthcare, and I get free, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's not how this is working, okay? These taxes aren't going to things they're going to directly benefit from per se, or even if they do, it's not their lives are better. It's like, the temple or the festivals or the Roman military. So the taxes back then were frustrating, to say the least. Even now, taxes are frustrating, and the reason why, it's a different reason. It's all dependent on, do you want to pay for your own things, or do you want someone else to pay them for you? That's the issue we face now. But even that's a different issue. Their frustration with taxes were different back then. So this burden of unpayable taxes led to a lucrative business for loan sharks. So again, you have loan sharks who are going to, people are like, well, I couldn't, for example, my crop didn't do as well this time, so I can't pay the tax, so I'm going to take out a loan to try and do it. But then you need to double pay later. And so loan sharks foreclosed on properties all the time. People couldn't repay their loans. They got sold into slavery or even debtors' prisons. That's where things get really nasty. Where it gets really nasty is that there was no relief for these taxes. If you couldn't pay them, it was basically a serious problem. And so there's a lot of reasons why tax collectors and loan sharks and things were disliked back then. Now, Hellenism was actually offered a way out of this of sorts. You could seek patronage, essentially. And this alleviated the needs of many seasonal laborers or other poor, because the wealthy were actually expected to give generously. This was a common thing, like give to the poor. It was actually a common thing. And so they were expected to give to the needy, and they did it through patron-client relationships. So the poor would support their benefactors politically. They'd give them public honor. They'd, preach their goodness and their kindness and things. But again, there's no real welfare system other than that. People fell through the cracks all the time. Now, what kinds of works were being engaged in general? Well, in the Jewish community, engaging in honest work was a high priority. Rabbis typically had to be bivocational. They had to earn their keep from a trade rather than religious activity. Money changers existed, and they extorted money. There were bakers and butchers and water sellers and leather working and luxury trades. So you had all that kind of stuff back then. It was a very diverse economy. You had teachers. They were humble, and it was even a despised occupation. And they were constantly having to run after customers asking for money. They worked long hours. They were often former slaves with no other trade to turn to because that's what they did when they were slaves. So respect for them was low. And one ancient writer, Juvenal, stated, quote, "Musicians and popular athletes earn more in a day than the teacher does in a year," end quote. And that's back then. So how things haven't changed. Family was the basic social unit in Israel in the New Testament times. So children were seen as a blessing from God, and barrenness was seen as a curse. Children didn't have any voice in the larger social world, but they were the most important thing in a family. If you lost anything, you did not want to lose your children. They were crucial as well to godly living, was to know one's place within one's household and to function honorably in it. So understanding what purpose you serve in a household was key. Men were the breadwinners. Typically, women worked hard in the domestic realm, but there was some crossover. It was expected that men would marry and assumed that something was wrong if they didn't. So you were really not fulfilling your male role if you did not marry and have children. Men increasingly were going to choose their own brides this time, but arranged marriages were still the norm in Israel. Polygamy was rare, in large part because people couldn't afford it. Jewish men typically married at 18, Romans by 25, and Greeks not until 30, but girls in all walks of life and persuasions married as soon as they hit puberty, usually early to mid-teens. And that was basically kind of because, again, the point was have children as soon as you are able. So Mary was almost assuredly a teenager when she was married. Could have been anywhere from 13 to 15, probably not older than that. Newlyweds typically lived in a father's house to live with extended family and in an additional room. Divorce was common, but somewhat less so in the Jewish world. It was still looked down upon. Jewish boys were sent to a school and synagogue from 5 to either 12 or 13, and then after that they worked either in their father's trade or they worked in a trade somewhere. Greek boys began school at age 7, and the Jews, however, studied the Bible exclusively. So the Greeks concentrated on Homer and rhetoric. There was a Hellenistic understanding of education. And rote memorization dominated both cultures. That was what they were learning, was how to memorize things. In adolescence, their education ended again, and boys learned a trade, often their fathers or apprenticed to another man. Few girls had access to formal education at this time. So that explains some of the issues with Paul and women, was that girls just didn't have access to education. Wealthier Roman women were given greater liberties to appear in public with or without their husbands and to participate in civic organizations and symposia and engage in promiscuity even. So things were a little different in Rome, especially among the wealthier people. But that makes sense. I mean, the frivolities and things like that, the luxuries that accrue with wealthier people in these situations. For entertainment and leisure, the Jewish boys loved the religious holidays, and they were an opportunity for celebration. The Sabbath was actually a joyous celebration and day of rest. You had festival worship. The Greeks and the Romans had no weekly days off, but to make up for that, they had numerous holidays and temple rituals and patriotic celebrations. In the Jewish communities, weddings and funerals lasted up to a week. They were community-wide events. Hellenized Jews participated in sporting events like the Olympic Games, chariot races, and gladiatorial shows. There were large theaters of comedies and tragedies, but these were off limits to more traditional Jews because of the pagan religious themes and allusions. So again, they were seen as Hellenizing. And the Jewish people enjoyed music and singing and dancing and storytelling and recreational board games even. Kind of funny. And it's funny when you discover a board game type thing back in that time. It's kind of cool, archaeologically. Now, in terms of science and medicine, the Roman world was advanced for its day. These discoveries were made under Ptolemy III, typically. You had Eratosthenes, who was the librarian in Alexandria, and he discovered the distance of the sun from the earth and conjectured the existence of the American continents even back then. Conjectured, so assumed. Botany underwent major advances. You had the taxonomy of plants. Geographers mapped the known world at that point with great accuracy. You had Pythagoras and Archimedes. They invented the principles of modern geometry centuries before Christ. You had architects and engineers building beautiful buildings and monuments. You You had physicians and dentists and sophisticated surgical instruments. They didn't have anesthesia. They had mild drugs, so things hurt. Doctors were paid poorly, but held in good repute, and it was actually the druggists who were suspect, because, again, once you get into that kind of stuff, the apothecaries and things, you can get into the sorcery. For example, the pharmakia. In the New Testament, when you read sorcery, it's often pharmakia or drug-related, so they were often suspect. Now, in terms of cultural anthropology and sociology, the main cultural values that were in place in the Jewish society were the honor-shame culture, and this permeated the ancient societies. Wealth and trade was less important than if one was honorable in all things. In America in modern day, it's typically wealth, influence, fame, but back then it was honor and shame. And this was either ascribed or acquired. So Jewish leaders repeatedly challenged Jesus' honor by asking questions designed to trap him, as in Mark 11:27 through 12:34. Jesus then avoided these traps and asked questions they could not answer, and so he acquired greater honor, whereas they were shamed in the eyes of the community. And so also the size of the following directly related to the honor in society's eyes. Jesus had a large following, but he was abandoned at the cross. When the multitudes left him, it made sense why he then asked the disciples if they were leaving too, in John 6:60 through 67. Again, Herod's killing of John was actually a matter of honor. That's why he did it. It was an honor to his oath and the dinner guests. You also had kinship loyalties. You had the group versus the individual personality. So they were far more group-centered back then. One owed responsibilities to one's extended family. Responsibilities, these are things you had to do. To your neighborhood, to your trade guild, and to your religious association. There were a lot of responsibilities to your community. As a result, people didn't really isolate people out of the community as often. I mean, that was a very severe thing. Nowadays, people just kick people out of communities without much of an issue. It's common if you just don't agree, or they say, oh, just go to a different community, just be a different part of things. People are more transient now. But back then, your community was everything, and to be isolated from the community was a serious, serious, serious issue. Kinship groups preserved genealogies. You knew who you were related to, and thus your good name must be upheld at any cost. Families worked together as single units of production, and sibling rivalry was squelched at the first signs. Like, you did not fight with your family members. Friends were fiercely loyal in responding to any reasonable request, but there was an understanding of reciprocal favor owed. In other words, if somebody did something for you, it was expected that you would do something for them down the line. The patriarch also determined the household's religious affiliation. All other members were to agree. And this is why Mark 3:31 through 35 is highly countercultural, which says, who are my brothers and my mother and my sister? It's those who do the will of the Father, not the actual family members. This is why it was very controversial. Now, it's important to know, though, that this also explains why conversions look the way they did in the book of Acts. A household father would convert, and his whole household would be baptized. Why? It was assumed that whatever the household man determined was going to be followed by the rest of the family, guaranteed, no question, and truly convert to conversions, too. So it's interesting that was in there, and that gives us hope as well for our families now, that the expectation is salvation for our children. Now, there is a perception of limited good. In America, we often view things as there is no limit to the pie. You can essentially create wealth, right? You can find a niche and create wealth for yourself. But back then, unless one was a member of the tiny percentage of wealthy, any significant increase in one's own standard of living was at someone else's expense. So there was a limited size or pie of material resources to be divided up. And so if you had more, you would share. If you had less, you would receive. And you were honor bound to repay. So there was kind of a system of just making sure everybody had enough to get by. And that's very true. There were no thank yous, just a repayment of favors. In fact, thanking a person would end the relationship of mutual give and take. So it's interesting because there's a thought that the Samaritan leper of Luke 17:19 or 11 through 19, who returns to give Jesus thanks, was not the man people would have expected Jesus to praise. Why? Because that meant he didn't owe Jesus anything. But the point of it was God's grace is given without the possibility of repayment. That was the focal point. It was, no, God is doing this for you as a gift. Character was also very important back then. It was as important as performance. So, you had to be both successful and have good character. Nowadays, that's not the case. You're successful, it doesn't matter what you act like. You also had purity and uncleanliness laws. These were pretty big as well. The Jews were constantly careful not to find themselves in a position of impurity or uncleanliness, and thus unable to worship in the temple with God's people. This could, by the way, result in permanent ostracism, like with the lady who had the bleeding issue. If that's the case, you're permanently unclean. Lepers, permanently unclean. I mean, these were curses. People viewed them as that way. They were a serious issue. Curses also were real things back then as well. Certain people had the ability to cast spells on others merely with the power of a malignant or stare or the evil eye. Matthew 6:23, Jesus is referencing the evil eye, the fact that eyes are evil, directly. And to avoid the curse, one should look at the world in wholesome ways, not coveting wealth or mammon. And then one's entire life would be pure. You also had the dietary laws, you had the food and hand-washing rituals in Mark 7:1-20. Eating with certain people could even make you unclean. And again, holiness or wholeness was much more contagious than immorality. And this is why Jesus is declaring all foods clean. Jesus is essentially saying, no, these things aren't going to make you unclean anymore. It's what comes from out within you that makes you unclean. These foods aren't what does it. And so all people now could be thought of as ritually pure as well when Jesus does this. And this had implications for the geographical gradations of holiness as well. So, the temple was the most holy place. Well, it's like, no, holiness is kind of going everywhere now. Now, in terms of past, present, future, modern people, they're more future-oriented. The present really is secondary, and the past doesn't really matter. In the ancient world, the present was the most important, then the past, and the future was of little concern because things were so tenuous at any point anyway. You didn't have these long-term plans because you were just hoping to make it to the next day at times. In terms of sociological advocacy models, so I want to mention this briefly. This is going to be kind of the end of our talk. All right, let me go ahead and close the register example conversation. So that's the gist of the socioeconomic background. What we now have to talk about is how people use the Bible. So the problem is you will have people like liberation theologians came after Vatican II, mainly in Catholic areas in Latin America. And you have some of it as well in the civil rights movement in America. And what this attempt is to attempt to look at the Bible and interpret it through a lens that it preaches liberation from oppressors. And so they derive this entire theology from that. Or you can have a feminist theology. And they try to view it as in, how does the Bible talk about women? And freeing women or oppressing women, whichever route you want to take on it. And so there's all these ways to try to use the sociological background to make the Bible say things that it doesn't actually say. And so my comment to all of that is this, is those are hermeneutics. Those are trying to read the Bible in a modern lens, in a lens that the Bible does not present, and trying to read things into Scripture, and you come out with very dangerous, very bad theologies when you do that. And so whenever you hear of things like, a feminist reading, or a liberation theology reading, or a Afrocentric reading of the Bible, or a Eurocentric reading of the Bible, those are all bad. We should simply approach the Bible, as I've argued many times, from a grammatical, historical, literal interpretation hermeneutic, a dispensational hermeneutic. We don't need those other lenses or views or focuses. We don't need those other perspectives because those perspectives are ultimately foreign to Scripture itself. And so it's important when understanding socioeconomic background, the point is to help us understand what actually was being said and why. It's not to impose a foreign lens upon the text. And with that, we're going to go ahead and conclude. I will open up a Zoom link for those who would like to discuss for a little bit here. It won't be too long tonight, but I will have a Zoom link open. This is the church meetings link. I'm going to go ahead and start it now. Copy invitation. Oop, that is way too big. I don't want that thing. Okay, let me go ahead and get us a link here. All right, and there's the link. All right, feel free and join on the link, and I will go ahead and say our closing statements now. Thank you so much for enjoying this talk on the socioeconomic background of the intertestamental period in the Introduction to Gospels series. I hope you've enjoyed this. I look forward to getting to discuss some of this with you. And again, I hope this information has been a blessing. We're going to be moving on to actually going through the Gospels in general on the next couple of lectures in this series. So I'm looking forward to that as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.